Welcome everybody to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Nikki Leader. Nikki is an ex-boarder with 3 decades of experience working as a holistic arts practitioner. Nikki supports adults on their trauma recovery journey through a spiritually informed approach that complements traditional psychological care. Her work focuses on helping individuals reconnect with a deeper sense of purpose, self-worth, and inner alignment through a toolbox of modalities, including soul plan readings, Reiki, and soul alignment mentoring. These are infused with an intuitive gift developed through her own healing journey. Welcome, Nikki.
Hi, Chris. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's amazing. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. We've been working with each other's diaries and things, but it's I usually like to start just sort of how we connected and how we came into each other's worlds. And we were just reflecting before we started recording on that it was via Dr. Lisa Cherry.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Lovely, amazing lady. So I'm very grateful to her.
Yes, same. Her work is fantastic. We did a podcast together. I was on her podcast and we talked about the similarities and differences between her care experience in the state care sector and the differences between sort of state group homes and fostering, and then also relating across to boarding schools and institution and residential schools there. And it was so fascinating and eye-opening. So I'm always very grateful to her for that conversation and the contact we've had since. So yes, thank you, Dr. Lisa Cherry. I'd love to start by getting a little bit more of an understanding about you and kind of where you came from. So, how were early years for you, Nikki? What was in your life at that point?
So I guess it's important to say for me personally that pre-boarding school, I was a very sensitive child. I had a very middle class, Surrey, privileged upbringing, 2 deeply loving parents, 2 brothers. All my cousins were boys, so I was the only girl in a very male orientated family by that stage. My sister then came along 7 years later. But I was deeply nervous, and there's an experience which I had that was almost underpinning some sort of trauma within me, even from a little girl. And it manifested physically, and I won't go into too much detail, but I was under every doctor under the sun and they could not find any problem at all. And what I've learned since, as I've sort of explored so much about the connection between our physical body and the emotional world, and how the physical body signposts so clearly what's going on in our emotional world, it turns out that fear was a really big underpinning quality that I had, and it seems around everything. So it's an interesting one for me, because the whole boarding school thing, I think that was just expanded everything. But my memory generally, and I don't know whether this blocks out certain things, but my memory generally was good. It was an all-girls school. And my parents' intention was that I would go there under the headmistressship of an amazing woman. Unfortunately, she left the term that I went and was replaced by somebody who actually, many years later, was the result of the demise of the school, and it was closed down. So she was not a healthy, rounded adult to run a girls' boarding school, let's just say that. But I feel that I was very sensitive, and there'll always be a debate, and as a parent myself, I changed my children's schools many times because they're all 3 very different characters, but also there were different times in my life, where my children's needs changed, and they changed very quickly, particularly to do with a trauma, which led me actually onto this path, which we'll go into a bit later. But it was very much decisions that I made, and I think as a parent, it's such if you have an inherent pattern of boarding school. My mother didn't go to boarding school, my father did, but they both lost their fathers at the age of 7. And so there were masculine role models missing from their life. And that, I think, has affected them in different ways as a woman and a man. But I definitely remember, and to a certain extent, actually still do. I feel very sensitive around people. I love animals. I feel very sensitive around people. So I guess part of the work that I do now helps me in that. And it's a blessing and a curse, actually, particularly in the age, I'm in my 60s now, and in the age of growing up, we've had the majority of this patriarchal environment, society that we've been living with. And that, without question, is shifting. And that's all unraveling, really, now. So there's all sorts of tools that now I can use, but I didn't have those at my disposal when I was younger. But I think that's important to say, because I don't necessarily blame boarding school for everything. And I remember my run up to that. There was a certain sort of achieve and you will be successful, or achieve and you will be a good girl, and that sort of thing. And I guess that just carried on. I went to boarding school at 11, but I was quite bright, so I was put in the year above myself, which again, I think led to its own issues. But in my world, that's my journey. That's part of my journey. It's part of my healing journey. And it's part of what I experienced and has got me to who and where I am today. And that's such an important part. And it means that I can do what I do. It means that I can support other people who are having certain experiences that they can either manage or not. So yeah, I think all of that's a whole kind of a load of ingredients that we put into the cake, is really my memory of my early childhood. But generally, I was much loved and very privileged materially, but I did feel very much slightly in the second place to my brothers.
Thank you for sharing, Nikki. Yeah, thank you. And boarding school for you then, very sad to hear that obviously there was a change in the management, if you like, and that meant a very different experience than you would have liked. And then it closing down, my senior school closed down 2 years after I left as well. And when you're in a school that it's sort of on its last legs, it's quite a strange experience. It's sort of on its way down, but the coming from a loving home, loving parents, as you said, how did you find? Was boarding school always going to happen for you at 11? Was it a choice? Do you remember talking about it? Was it one that perhaps obviously not one that your dad went to because it was an all-girls school, but was it always on the cards for you?
Not necessarily, I don't think. And obviously, it's hard to know what conversations my parents had. For my brothers, absolutely. That was mapped out for them, no question. But for me, I don't actually have a huge memory of having conversations. What I do remember, and I'm sure this choice will have been led by me, what I do remember is that they got special meals before they went back to school. So the night before, we all went out to special supper. And so there was a specialness behind that idea of going to boarding school. They got a big trunk. They had a tuck box. It was full of sweets. It was a uniform. There was all this stuff being bought. And I wonder if that really affected me, and thought, well, hang on a minute, I want a bit of that. Do you know what I mean?
Ooh.
Which seems so shallow, but it's beautifully childish and innocent. And it would have been very much about that, actually. And it's amazing how important those things are, and whether that was a more subconscious feeling of, I'm not as special as they are, therefore if I go to boarding school. And it kind of did manifest. I got everything new bought for me. It was all special and that sort of thing. So I think more subconsciously, rather than a full memory of sitting down and having a conversation about, do you want to go or not? So yeah, if there was anything, that probably would be consciously what I remember.
Yeah, thank you. As you know, we've been working on the piece, Is Boarding School Right for My Child? which you've contributed to, and is nearly ready to go out there. But that piece of work's been fascinating to hear from different contributors, different perspectives, lived
I'm sure.
experience, therapists, etc. And what really came out of that was this real fascination for me around the conversations that were had in families, the level of knowing that young people had before they went, what they were told, and then how it was managed along the way. So for those who didn't enjoy it, if they let their parents know they didn't enjoy it, what was the answers coming back? Where children moved, and you alluded to that as a parent, which we'll come on to more, but that you felt your children have needed different experiences at different times, different schools, etc. So yeah, thank you for sharing yours. As someone who, you've referenced the move away from sort of more patriarchal, masculine world towards the age of Aquarius, towards the feminine, and yeah, the real change happening out there. What was your experience as a young woman growing up in a boarding school, in an all girls school? What was maybe some of the gold, and maybe what were some of the challenges of that kind of upbringing?
I think part of the gold was your entire environment is based around feminine and what that means. So, when we started developing as women, when we go through puberty, all that sort of thing, you could share that. There was no shame or embarrassment. Everybody was in the same situation. It was quite a high flying school. So, sport and everything was really praised. Doing well was praised. I was a very belligerent and sort of rebellious teenager. So apparently my name repeatedly is in the detention book that somebody saw years later. But my memories were actually of being cheeky and naughty. I think the teaching for me, I was that person who said this is an absolute waste of my time. Certain subjects and this sort of thing, that it was hard to concentrate because it was not interesting. But I'm sure that many people in their 60s have probably got memories of education of being like that, which of course we now know, as education is beginning to fall on its feet, there has to be changes, and there will be. AI is going to see that it doesn't matter how human anybody behaves in that way. We're now being forced that it's got to change. But it didn't hold a lot of my interest. Music was my savior. Sport was my savior. And those creative outlets, and that creativity versus physical. But I do remember being desperately homesick at times. And, lots of tears, particularly early on. And the gold was my friends, actually. And I think that is a shared community where, I've lived in Asia and I've been an expat and I've traveled the world on my own. And part of the beauty in that is you have to talk to people, you have to connect with people, because that's what we do as humans. And I feel that in boarding school, part of the gold of that can be that you make friends who really are sharing your experiences. And there's an empathy there that maybe other people at day school cannot have. And it kind of did set me up in a way. I traveled the world on my own. I'm quite an independent person anyway, but that boarding school experience gave me the confidence and resilience in a way to face a lot of things in life that, life is messy and it's hard and it's crappy sometimes. It's not easy. Nobody promises us a life free of suffering. That's not to say it needs to happen very early on. But for me personally, I look back and I wonder how much of my resilience and my ability to manage and navigate life has come partly from that experience. But also, I do remember being desperately homesick, making sure that if I didn't want to do something, I would get into the sanatorium where I could just lie and pretend I'm sick. All of that sort of, those patterns where you keep yourself safe. and that comes at any means and any cost. So obviously that is what has to unravel later on.
Indeed, yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, I think faking sick to go to the SAN, and yeah, I remember putting thermometers on light bulbs and trying to warm them up and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Ultimately, looking back on it now, my nervous system was burnt out,
Yeah.
and I needed a break because for me, the constant sort of survival process was exhausting, and often as well, if my friends went in there, I wouldn't want my friends to be apart from me because, well, there's friendship, but also actually for me there was a deep fear, there was a deep sort of paranoia that if they went, they would come back and they wouldn't like me anymore. They wouldn't be my friends anymore once they'd gone away. So I had to stay with them at all costs and keep them on side. So that was again part of my sort of survival instinct there. But it sounds like, I mean, I've had so many experiences contrary for young women who went through boarding schools where it was, the adolescence process, puberty, etc., that was deeply shamed within the schools, that was, really, really unhappy and unhealthy. But it sounds like your school was better. Perhaps that ethos that the old head had left behind was still sort of in there in the ethos, if you like.
Well, she was new when I went there. And so for me, between the ages of 11 and sort of 13, 14, you completely rely on your friends. Most of the teachers, the average age was probably 60. A lot of them didn't have their own children. And, we would look on that now as having a very different experience of life. And therefore, they are different adults with perhaps different values, different emotional compasses as well. And at that time, it was very much, England itself was, pull your socks up and get on with it sort of thing. And that's when we really learn to suppress our authentic emotions. And that really is the thing, isn't it? A boarding school experience, when we sort of zoom in on it, is really about disconnecting from any authenticity, of being fearful about expressing emotions, because we don't know at that stage, particularly as a teenager, what really a safe space looks like. You can't create that for yourself, and therefore you stifle all forms of creativity. So you're on this sort of hamster wheel of just being good, getting good exam results, all those things that do not fan any form of emotional guidance, really. And that's where the work that I do now, sort of, we adapt everything, we start performing all those things at school, and then it's so, when you do the work later on, it's so recognizable. So it's it's an interesting start to life.
Yeah, thank you. And I know you referenced there the education changing and AI. I think it'd be lovely to come on to that actually, because those two topics, as you know, I'm really passionate about, and we're working within Seen and Heard. But you've neatly sort of encapsulated some of the challenges that that upbringing has around putting away of the full self, kind of putting on the mask, if you like, and then heading out into the world. So as you finished school and as you moved into life, what were you carrying that started to then materialize, and how did that set you on your journey? You talked about traveling the world and things alone, but what came next for you?
Well, I eventually ended up by getting thrown out of that school after my GCSEs. And that was, I think, the beginning. But also my parents were going through a divorce that was quite a long process over many, many years. So things became very unstable by that stage. And I then went through sort of 2 or 3 colleges in various guises. But when I left school, I was very young because I'd jumped a year. And I started off as a cleaner, actually. I was very resourceful, and I would just put a sign up, and I think looking back, obviously what it did, and lots of therapists and psychologists will analyze this, but it just gives you that independence. And is that a bad thing? I don't know. Because what I do know is I've managed to create every opportunity for myself that I've had in life, which has ended up by doing everything that I've wanted to do in so many ways. If I've needed money, I'm prepared to do any job, which I started at 15, 16. And then I ended up just finding my own work, whereas my brothers got support and help. And I recognize all my brothers' friends, their fathers were talking to their friends to get them into businesses. And it was all kind of this path, kind of being laid out for them. And I'm not saying that that's what I wanted. On the contrary, that's a whole other conversation, isn't it? Sons following their father's path. But for me, I look back and maybe it was such a gift, because it's also the nature of the beast, isn't it? We're all different. We're all here to walk the path of the journey that we're here to walk. But I think I was very lucky in that and I still think I have a huge inner strength to manage and navigate things that can go catastrophically wrong. And they have done regularly in my life. So who knows, when I go back and I reflect back, I thank goodness for all the people who I've worked with, therapists, everybody who I've seen most of my life, because it's helped me unravel things at that time. But I ended up by traveling. I worked in London for a little bit. London wasn't particularly my thing. And I very strongly felt that there was such a big world out there and I was going to go and find it. So I did. And I just sold everything. And I got on a plane with a round the world ticket, which cost me £500, sold everything, and off I went. No mobile phones then. I didn't really tell my parents, everything about where I was going, because I think a young girl at that stage on their own in the early 80s, traveling the world with no mobile phone, they probably would have not wanted me to go or come and picked me up and taken me home. But that sort of led to huge exploration of the world and different cultures and different people, and how are the rest of the world living? Because right now in England, my experience of, sort of boarding school and then England and whatever, it just wasn't, it wasn't feeding me. I suppose it was that lack of nourishment that made me go and find something else. And maybe the lack of emotional nourishment at school, maybe that had become my comfort zone. And it did give me, it's handed me opportunities, because I don't expect anything from any experience that I have. The adventure and the fun of it is just to go and do it without any expectation. But yeah, that's where I went on to.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So traveling the world, what was a key place, a key moment from that really stood out, that you think perhaps went on to shape you? Was there a real kind of eyes open moment?
I've always been very, very drawn to children. And so a lot of where I went was led by, I went to volunteer in a school in Thailand, but I only got asked because I had an accent and I had an English voice. And the little place I was staying with in Thailand said, "Oh, you've got a really English voice. Will you come into the school?" I started off in Hong Kong. In England, my father, I guess, had said to me, "What about the city?" Absolutely no way I was ever going to go and work in the city of London. But that was my rebellious, no, don't stereotype me. But I went to Hong Kong and I was actually really interested in the whole financial world in Hong Kong. It was staggering, the money that was being made in Hong Kong, the excitement and everything. It kind of completely refreshed and restored my energy being in Hong Kong. It was exciting. It was completely different to anything I'd experienced. And I think along my journey, I traveled mostly on my own. I went down to Australia and then I did what a lot of people now call the gap year. But I did it in the early 80s when it was mostly German and Scandinavian people who were in Asia at that point. But I had some extraordinary experiences, some very negative ones, where somebody spiked my drink, and I then got amoebic dysentery. Nobody in the world knew where I was. I couldn't get to any phone. But there's always been something in me that has always known that I'll be okay. And again, does that come from my experience of being sent away, of actually, I was always okay. There was some very negative experiences, but we didn't get beaten at school. My brothers went to prep school, and they did. And there was fagging at their schools, and there was that awful kind of Tom Brown school days experience still there. I didn't have that at my school. They weren't physically going to abuse girls. I don't know what happened to other girls. My son was at a boys' prep school, and their chaplain is now in jail. And that's much more recent than when I was at school. But we had a lot of female teachers as well, but they were, some of them, just nasty and bitchy. They weren't physically abusive, and I think that's also the difference. And I can only give my experience of the school. But it certainly wasn't a beautiful, fertile garden where I was going to be the best version of myself or achieve anything close to what I was capable of.
Yeah, thank you, Nikki. And so, yeah, hearing about the vibrancy of Hong Kong and traveling, Thailand, Australia. But you've referred to this a few times, this kind of not the version of myself that you were kind of going to end up being. What happened then to you? What was the journey through to, you mentioned many years of therapy and things for yourself. What was it that took you into a therapist's office and said, right, there's some stuff I need to unpack here? What got you there?
So yeah, there's a couple of times in my early life where that happened. Firstly was when I ended up by staying much longer in Hong Kong than I thought I would. I married a wonderful man. We had our first child there, but there was then something in me that everything about Hong Kong became very toxic for me. And I realized that I was really losing who I was in that Hong Kong environment. And not over a specific time, but we then came back to England. And I feel that not necessarily boarding school, but there are certain relationships I've had with my life that have obviously guided my relationships later on in my life. And I first started having therapy actually in my early 30s. But that was very much around who I was. And I wasn't liking myself anymore. And there's nothing more uncomfortable about not liking yourself when you're in a relationship and you just cannot. I had disconnected, as I mentioned before, from my authenticity. I couldn't find any self-compassion in a way for myself. And I think also early on in my childhood, it's about also feeling seen. And the school I was at was quite a big school. And so I would often overcompensate in order to be seen, and which I think is very common. And that's when I really started there was I married to a really kind, really good man. And I just couldn't, everything in life became something I didn't want to look at. So I wasn't liking any of the mirrors that I was seeing, which of course was very much about me. And that's really when I started therapy. And then I met an energy healer, which was a very foreign world to me in the late 90s. And this led up to a massive trauma that was about to happen that I obviously wasn't aware of. But that's, I guess, the most interesting time. My therapist really helped me sort of almost reground and also give me permission and a space to express myself, express my anger, express my frustration, express my lack of understanding of the world that I had and was living in. I just couldn't get it. I couldn't understand why some people behave the way they do. And I guess how that affected me was, I want to break out of this. And that felt like a cage of my life up until that point. And there had to be something different, because it wasn't a comfortable place for me. The world was not a comfortable place to be. And actually, I often look back and I look at, I understand now why, when I watched TV in those days, and there was Rolf Harris and there was Jimmy Savile and there were all these people, and I actually felt sick every time these people came on the television. Now I know why. And children are so intuitive and actually have a really good understanding of the world and what's going on. They know what's going on, but they can't do anything about it or fix it, and so that's where we do start to suppress everything, not just our emotions, but our voice, and therefore our actions as well.
Thank you, Nikki. Yeah, I think young people are hugely undervalued in society, and particularly in England is, Western culture. There's parts of it that are okay, but largely we undervalue young people. England, I think, because of our background, it is particularly bad. And even the name "Seen and Heard" comes from that. Children should be seen and not heard. And it also comes from the two things I wanted to be when I was young and wasn't. So you speak there about wanting to be heard, and then the behaviours that kind of the overcompensation, if you like, then to find ways to be heard, whatever it is. And also really hearing that at some point, in my experience, the mask slips at some point, and you go looking, it's relatively thin, that ego, that exterior, and so at some point it's going to crumble. Mental health, physical health, relationship, whatever it is that triggers it. And obviously, most of the people that come to Seen and Heard are in that place. The things are slipping, and they're then looking for the answers. So I hear your therapist, and then energy healing. So when energy healing came into your life, then what was the difference, perhaps, to sort of some of the talking therapy or things like that maybe you got into? What started to move for you?
Well, firstly, on your point, I just quickly want to say that when I reflect back, I do feel that also the time out that I had of just floating and traveling around the world with no timetable, no expectation, that really buys into now what people are understanding as taking time out in nature. Rest is a doing word. It's all those, all that kind of stuff. But the energy healing I really stumbled upon. There was a shop window that I kept driving past on my school run, and it said energy therapy clinic. And I just kept looking at it thinking, what is that? There was nothing in the window. And I thought maybe it was something to do with electricity or energy as we know it. Anyway, so I was selling some magnetic bracelets for a girlfriend going through a divorce. And I said, look, I'll help you. And for some reason, one day I pulled in and I said, are these anything to do with what you do? And the girl in there completely laughed, because she knew that anybody who went in there was drawn in there and for some reason needed to be there. So she said, well, would you like to come for a session and I'll show you? And I said, absolutely, I'd love to. New experience, that's what I love. And the difference was she put her hands on my shoulder and I just fell apart completely. Her energy alone held me in a space that for my body just completely, and I wept and I wept. No talking therapy. Yes, I had cried in talking therapy, but I hadn't got close to actually that sort of release. And that build up of driving past there every day, I think, was just preparation. And then that particular day was the day when my body said, okay, let's go, we're ready. And sadly, she's not around anymore, but she was a phenomenal healer, and very intuitive, psychic, whatever words you're comfortable with. And I ended up by working with her, teaching with her, doing all sorts. But she was the lead into, and 2 years later, I had a catastrophic, fatal car accident with my partner who died in the car accident. My psychic senses exploded. I was seeing every car crash on the road. And that is how I got into this work. And still to this day, when people look at me, what I tell them, what I do, because I also do tarot readings and I work very intuitively, they sort of look at me and say, well, what's your story? Because they sort of feel that maybe I picked up a deck of cards or I read a book or something. This journey chose me. There is absolutely no doubt. And I feel that our journey potentially does choose all of us, actually. So whichever way you look at it, from the beginning to the end or the end to the beginning, they're kind of one and the same. I think it's a chosen path, which doesn't look pretty sometimes. And that's the time when we don't want to say, oh, I chose this. But the reality for me is everything is chosen. To a certain, I have to be honest and true to my world, because I can't take responsibility and own the amazing work that I've done and the amazing things that happen if I can't own the other stuff too. And I know that's quite sobering, because there are some awful things that happen. But I genuinely believe, because when I have that belief, I know that unraveling, that is where you step into your power. Just unraveling that story, you step back into your power again, and start creating something different.
Thank you. There's so much there I want to sort of come to, but very, very sad to hear about the accident. I mean, that's absolutely heartbreaking, and yeah, my heart is with you there.
Thank you.
And then to hear about also that moment where the healer you were working with put her hands on you and you just fell apart. And I think there's therapy for all different kinds, for all different times in your life.
Yeah.
For me, started at sort of 20 something at uni for a drink problem and paranoia and anxiety and all that sort of stuff. And at that point, given where my mind was, where my ego, sort of my stories in my head were, the thought of energy healers and things, I was pulling well away from that, because my mum, who had a brain tumor when I was 13, 14, and she died then, those last 3-4 years before she died, she was desperately searching for something. I can now see. We were in Glastonbury every other weekend trying to, find, or she was, I was at boarding school, but she was trying to find an answer to something, and she was trying everything. And ultimately she didn't get there in time. But I now, there's been in my healing work a real sort of passing on of the baton from her to me, healing with her spirit, etc., where I'm kind of very open to the idea that sometimes mainstream talk therapy is exactly what people want and need, and they're exactly ready for that. And then at other times it might be something different that unlocks them, or that their body is just ready to give it up, like you said. As we know, The Body Keeps the Score, Bessel van der Kolk's amazing book that sort of helps us to understand that trauma and energy, held very much within the body, and it's one system, not mind and body. It's just a super system. So it's fascinating. But
I always feel I'm never ready to convince anybody.
yeah.
I have a huge respect for the psychological and therapeutic space, because I've been through it. But what I'm offering is a complementary perspective to that. I think that's really important to mention. And often, when I work, people will say, oh, what if you tell me something bad? And that's a huge mirror. And I just, my answer often to that is, what else is bad in your life? And get them to explore that. What does that look like? What does that mean to them? What is bad? Because we're all going one way. You know what I mean? So it's always interesting. But yes, very much alongside. And as you say, we all have different needs in our lives. But what's beautiful now, I feel, in the world is all the options that are being offered. And part of that is the fact that the internet can now bring us so much. Even indigenous tribes, with all their wisdom and knowledge and history, is able to get on the internet now and share ancient stories and things. There's so much that is now being mirrored back to us, and the reflection of the environment and the state of that is fascinating how it's panned out.
It really is. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I think for me, I've had that so much recently with, I have a therapeutic shamanism practice that I work with, and that's very much opened my eyes to the kind of the original blueprint, if you like, of us as hunter-gatherers, and what happened then with the fall over the last 6,000 years into kind of civilization and agriculture, and the stepping away from nature, and the kind of sickness that's occurred. I when I was able to put words to that, I knew at a knowing level, not thinking, not feeling, but at a knowing level, I knew it was true, and that's helped to open things up. And I think you referenced it as well. In your sharing of how things were when you felt things start to drop away, is that you felt you stepping back into authenticity and understanding. So, what was the path from your healing, your stepping forward into then working with others, and how did that happen for you?
It happened. Well, it happened after the crash. I had met somebody who was a tutor at the College of Psychic Studies about, I guess, 9 months, a year before this happened, having had a couple of healing sessions at this therapy clinic. And she said, "Oh, I've got this person coming to do a workshop called Meet Your Spirit Guides." And I thought, again, exciting, interesting. Let's give it a go. I'm open to anything. And I had this extraordinary sort of deja vu and sense when I walked in the door, and I hadn't really experienced that before. But I said, wow, I really feel like we've either met before, or I feel like I know you. And I was completely new to any of this. And she said, "Oh, okay." So we carried on with the workshop, and it was really about tuning into your intuition through stillness, guided meditation, and then using the chakra system to open up your energy field in order to feel and sense different things. And we had a very simple exercise, and we worked in pairs. And I said to her when we left, "I'm sure I'm going to see you again." And she was going down to live with her daughter in Australia. Well, my brother and sister live in Australia. So I thought, well, maybe it'll be Australia. A while later, I had this car crash. But I mean, I could go on forever. There's so many coincidences. I had a tarot reading 3 weeks before the car crash. And on reflection, it was all over the tarot reading. She didn't spell out what was going to happen, but there are certain details of that crash that were absolutely in pictures in the cards. So that was also interesting and humbling. But after the crash, I literally I would start to feel as I'm driving around, I think, oh my God, there's been a crash. And then I'd turn on the radio and they say, oh, there's been a crash on the M3 or whatever. And I thought, wow, I really need to kind of manage this. I can't function really properly with it. But also I wasn't driving at that time. So I was very much in stillness, and I read and read and read about all this stuff, all the early sort of 80s books, Many Lives, Many Masters, starting, and I mean, so many. And I went to the College of Psychic Studies, and I called them up, and they said, well, I'm sorry, there's a waiting list for her classes. You can't get on to her classes. And about a month later, somebody called me and said, oh, did you know that the teacher's back from Australia? And it hadn't worked in Australia. So she was back at the college. I called the college and they said, she's doing a 4-week short course. And I said, get me on it now. I just knew. And in the process of doing that, I had a sitting with her. She brought through my partner, who was in spirit, obviously. So she's a medium. And she said to me, I have a space in my class and you're going to be doing what I'm doing. And I said, well, that's a real waste of 70 quid that I've just spent, because I don't, how's that ever going to happen? So I kind of walked away thinking that's ridiculous. And here I am, you know. But short story, I ended up by training at the College of Psychic Studies, and I started to work doing sittings for people to help people who were really stuck in their grief. And one tiny piece of evidence changes everything for somebody. And it's the same really with the soul plan reading. So each tool that I've learned along the way, and actually I met Dr. Lisa Cherry through, I did a massage course. That was the very beginning of when I started working with clients. And obviously I do believe, I also needed to ground and to have that touch and that sort of thing. And I met Lisa, and she got off the couch because she was one of my bodies as a case study. And she said, I don't know what you were doing, but it wasn't just massage. And when I then trained as a Reiki master and did Reiki, she did the same. She said to me, you were giving Reiki before you even knew you were giving Reiki. Mm. I knew there was something. And I've gone on to work with horses, and the work that I particularly use in the mentoring arena is the soul plan reading, because it's deeply, deeply powerful. But what it does is it gives so much deep internal clarity and understanding that you sort of see yourself in a completely different way. And you can start to really understand those unfelt emotions, or the emotions that you just don't understand at the time when you're at school or when you're in your early childhood. And it can really sort of help understand what's been going on, I found.
Thank you, Nikki. I'd love to talk about the soul plan. But let's do that in a sec. The one thing I just wanted to touch on was the subject of touch, because one of the key challenges with boarding schools, for instance, is an absence of appropriate touch for a young person growing up. And I look at myself now in my relationship with my children, my partner, and I'm like one of those Labradors that sort of needs to always have a paw on your foot.
Yeah.
I mean, if anyone's met a Labrador like that, they'll be near you, and they'll just they want to know you're there, sort of thing.
Yeah.
I'm like that, and it's because I've, over the last 3 or 4 years since my breakdown, I'm reacquainting with the importance of touch. Your reference around the massage, or sort of almost giving Reiki without knowing, having trained. A friend of mine I went to boarding school with is an acupuncturist, a brilliant one, but he employs a lot of massage, and he has clients who come in for a frozen shoulder and end up having a full-on sort of spiritual awakening mid acupuncture session, because he has a gift for it. He listens, he sees someone, he feels what's going on, and he will give that person whatever is for their highest good. And so I think there are people right across the spectrum, but it's something about the physical touch, particularly those with relational trauma from childhood, where touch was either inappropriate or there was no touch. Once that touch starts to come back into people's lives, you see things move. And that's why I practice emotional freedom technique, the tapping, the touch, because it's so important, particularly if you're dissociated, if you're heavily in your floating head, which a lot of traumatized people are. So thank you for picking up.
Touch is grounding. We get our energy back into our body, or it leaves our body through inappropriate touch, obviously. But it's when somebody touches your physical body, you're sort of saying, I'm here. I'm here. I'm safe. I'm in my body. I'm here. And that's, the importance of grounding. And I'd love to do some research actually around, because obviously there are different love languages, and it would be really interesting to see how many ex-boarding school pupils, their love language is touch. I've never really thought about it. It was only as you were speaking just now. It would be really, obviously there are different love languages, but love language is a touch. Sometimes it's doing things for somebody, or all these different love languages that we have. But it would be interesting.
Yes, that would. I mean, until I had my breakdown, I was the classic ex-boarder, workaholic, alcoholic. touch was kind of done when required.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. And the only thing that was slightly different, but that was actually with my children. When my children were born,
Yeah.
it woke me up
Yeah.
to that. But I still didn't have it for my partner at that point, or my friends. And particularly men's groups and men's work and things like that. They're learning to have a proper hug with another guy and
Yeah.
not be pushing the eject button on the back and not be stiff as a board and just all those things, real big part of the journey. But thank you for mentioning touch, because I think particularly for anyone listening, maybe looking for different things to try or pursuing different ideas. I think certainly for me, talk therapy was very, very powerful when I started to connect with my body more. Yoga, meditation, emotional freedom technique, or massage, or acupuncture, or
Yeah.
when I connected with you for a soul plan reading, which we'll come on to now. It was groundbreaking. A lot happened. So let's talk soul plan reading. Dr. Lisa Cherry, when she connected us, we spoke, we hit it off with the things we're into, and you very kindly offered me a soul plan reading, and it was transformative for me. It was fascinating. It challenged a lot of my woo-woo radar. Yeah, really honestly, because I'm still coming into the idea of things like energy healing or any of these sort of things that aren't psychotherapy and mainstream medicine. So it challenged a lot of stuff for me, but that alongside a number of the breakthroughs I've had in my coaching with Piers Cross and other stuff, it was amazing, really, really brilliant. So what is a soul plan reading, and what does it do for people?
Okay, so a soul plan reading, in simple terms, is based on the sound of the letters of your birth name. So we take your name as an energetic footprint with the view that sound is deeply, deeply important, and each letter has a sound. So when we put those letters together, it forms a footprint of your name. Some would say that you choose your name before you come at soul level. And we have a chart. So we spend 75 minutes on a Zoom call. So there's a chart and it looks like the Star of David. And it's kind of split into two halves. It's your worldly, 3 areas: challenges, talents, and goals. And then your spiritual challenges, talents, and goals. But it draws on numerology. It draws on astrology. It draws on the Egyptian alphabet. So what we're talking about is a lot of Eastern philosophy that integrates into this. And, we know that ancients used so many symbols, and each pair of numbers has a symbol with it. But it's also what it does is it does offer insight to your core challenges. And again, that takes a little bit of time to understand and to process. So that's why we talk about it. And then I send you a report so that you can kind of sit with it. But ultimately, what it does for me is, and my sense was when I had mine done, first of all, I thought I need to train in this because it is so powerful in helping take ownership of your life. This is who I am. This is my name, which is the version of identity that we associate with somebody, their name. But it's so your name is almost like a key that unlocks this whole energetic footprint of the challenges that, in theory, you've chosen to take on in this lifetime, the talents you've given yourself, and the qualities of those, which will always help you overcome your challenges, and the goals are things like environments you work in, relationships you have, experiences that you choose. So this is very much based on a perspective of I own and take responsibility for my life, what's happened in it, what is going to happen in it, how I can navigate it, how I can use this knowledge of who I am to understand. So there's no blame for anybody else in the world. Nothing is anybody else's fault. It is about learning how to find that inner world, that inner emotional world at a deeper level, so that you can find that clarity not from external validation, but from your own internal compass. And that really, I mean, how do you feel that's a fair
Yeah,
description of it? You've had
yeah. I
it.
mean, thank you, Nikki, for explaining it. What you just said there was the biggest thing that I needed from it, and that I got was, in psychotherapy and classical, that radical acceptance. It's a feature of nearly all therapy. Doesn't matter what. At some point,
Yeah,
you've got to own your stuff,
yeah,
and at some point, you've got to stop pointing fingers outwards, and at some point, you've got to move out of victim.
yeah.
And in my coaching work, or the work at Seen and Heard, primarily, I know where someone is in their journey by the amount they point outwards. And that's it. So someone who's done an awful lot of work, there is little or no outward blame into the world, or being a victim. Now, everyone's at different phases, so there's no I,
Absolutely.
there's no sort of anger towards that. Sometimes it can be a little bit frustrating when people are stuck in victim, because you can't move forward at that point. It's a holding space. It's just about providing a safe environment for them to process through that side of things, and help to guide of whatever might be appropriate. But the soul plan reading, because it laid out the ownership of name, which for me had been almost taken away. So when you, particularly at boarding school, you go there, you become a surname or you become a nickname. Your name is taken away, a bit like it would be in prison. You become a number,
Mhm.
and so you get to reclaim your name. You get to reclaim the fact that maybe the journey you've walked, which is for me a lot of trauma, there was a reason for a lot of that trauma, and it shaped who I am now, and therefore there was almost okay, right. I've done a lot of healing work around the trauma. I have a roadmap now. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? What is my purpose? What is my second half going to look like?
Yeah.
And what have I got to draw on? You talked about your strengths and things. So thank you. Yeah.
But it also acknowledges that what I was also hearing from that was you were understanding other people more.
Mm-hmm.
The soul plan will meet you where you're at in in so many ways. But the strength of it is I feel that I I felt seen in a new way.
Mm-hmm.
It was like the mirror was looking back. Me in the mirror was looking back at me in a very different way. And that's hugely empowering. And I always say to people, just take what resonates. It's not about believing anything, it's about being curious. And I think, we know that in old age, if you stay curious, you'll live well. You'll live long and you'll live well. And it's not so much about what people think they should believe or think they should do something. I am much more interested in what people feel, because that is going to be their gut is going to be their compass for all time,
Mm-hmm.
really. We know the research on the electromagnetic field of the heart, and the messages from the gut to the brain and that sort of thing. So it's reclaiming in a way what was lost. And
Mm-hmm.
whether that is a boarding school experience, whether that is your carers or your parents, that situation. So that's when I started to have much deeper self-compassion for myself,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore for other people.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I really feel that when I can meet people where they're at without wanting them to be any different from who they are
Mm-hmm.
at that time. And that makes life a lot easier. It makes life a lot more fun. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just an acceptance, as you say, that radical acceptance. You're you, I'm me. Let's just be that.
Mm. Yeah. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you. I think it's so the challenging of my beliefs. So a number of the things that you practice, that you've trained in, that have been helpful in your life, they've all been things that naturally, because my mum had gone towards them,
Yeah.
particularly numerology, astrology. Just thinking back to herself, aromatherapy, reflexology, crystals. So, so she was doing this in the late 80s, I suppose. And me being in a straight laced patriarchal boarding school environment at the same time as her doing this, I pulled away from it.
You would do,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, and I was very disparaging of it for decades afterwards, all hippie nonsense and woo woo and all this sort of stuff. And you know, you know what I'm finding now is anything that connects you to either yourself or something greater than you or nature, those three things are going to help. So whatever it is that gets you there, whatever name you call it, just that recognition of mind, body, and soul,
Yeah.
kind of. I see a lot of people spiritual bypassing. They're doing loads and loads of stuff over here, and they're not looking at themselves or their body.
Yeah.
Or lots of people are doing really heady analytical processing. That's fab, but they're not looking at the soul, or they're not looking at their physical health or whatever. Or they're super gym bunnies and they're mega healthy and eating everything, but not looking at their own stuff, not looking at soul. So it's that real sort of pyramid of mind, body, soul that has started to fall in place for me, and I can only speak to I, but it's been transformative as each bit of the jigsaw's come in, and the soul plan reading was excellent. So I wanted to thank you for that gift.
Oh, my pleasure. And
Mm.
and I wonder, I don't know how old you were when your mother um, was ill, but I suppose we're always looking for a fix. And when something doesn't fix, we say, well, that doesn't work.
Mm.
We don't know what doesn't work, and we don't know what does work or doesn't work. It's that thing. What actually does work? Do we really know? Do we really know? We know our expectation of a fix has a certain outcome to it,
Yeah.
and your outcome didn't get met.
Mm.
And so I can completely understand why you would turn away from it and say, well, that was that didn't really do anything. But
Mm.
maybe it did. Maybe it did so much for her, and maybe it didn't. But we don't know. And I feel that the way we're moving forwards with the world now is we're not going to know anything really, apart from our own feelings, our inner compass, how we create things. But a lot of our external world is not going to be certain, and we're not going to know if it's true.
Mm.
When we
Mm.
look at AI, we look at all these things externally, and I feel that that's why this whole sort of spirituality, well-being world is exploding, which again is a blessing and a curse in some ways. But it's so interesting that I really just feel to know yourself is really the real job of life now, is to really know yourself. And that whole self-awareness journey, as you say, wherever and however you get there, I believe that that is what is going to bring comfort in the world, is to know yourself.
Mm. Thank you, Nikki. It's so powerful. As we move towards bringing the conversation to a close. I think the AI touched on changing and improving education. Something I know we both aligned on, around education for young people, not just being about the IQ stuff, about the book learning, but about knowing yourself. About
Yeah,
we're advocating for things like motion coaching and breath work and
yeah,
EFT in schools, emotional freedom technique in schools, and getting back to this original blueprint, really, of power from nature, getting recognizing that connection, and it's exploding now, as you say.
that's the word, is connection.
Yeah.
I think disconnection is the epidemic of the century, really, and anything that is going to reconnect us back, as you say. It's
Mm.
yeah, it's a fascinating time to be alive, I think.
It really is.
Mm.
Thank you. Yeah. So as we start to wrap up, there's a great sort of sign off that connection. Um, yeah, is our strap line on Seen and Heard is making meaningful connections, and it
Yeah.
was exactly for that reason. But this has been a really meaningful connection, as the soul plan reading you did for me, fantastic. Is there anything else you want to leave people with? Any thoughts, any ideas, anything about your work that you wanted to mention before we finish?
Um, yeah, I just feel, in a way, I feel that the work that I do is, if there is one word or one symbol on the soul plan reading that can shift someone's story, then my work is done.
Mm,
Do you know what I mean?
mm,
And I feel that I'm very big on, as you've probably heard, of taking on new opportunities, new experiences. And actually, if there is anything that resonates in this conversation, the soul plan is just one way that you can go deeper,
yeah.
actually. And if any, I'm always happy to hold space for someone who wants to explore that self-awareness. And again, if it brings some insight and some healing and some reflection, then yeah, it's what I love doing.
Well, thank you, Nikki, and that comes across in this conversation, in the work that you did with me. Yeah, if anyone's out there, I highly recommend having a chat with Nikki about whatever's going on. There's so many different ways you can come at this because of your different background,
Yeah.
your personal experience, your training. But I think that the key message for me is, it's so sad when people come to Sinhad who said maybe they've tried something and it hasn't worked, so they've given up. Well, I'm too broken. I've given up on that. And I say, just, there's so much out there. Just go try some stuff.
Yeah.
And we try and make that happen. If financially, if it's not possible, we've got a funding support program and things that's seen and heard. But yeah, go try some stuff. A lot of it's free. It doesn't cost anything to take your shoes off and go and walk in nature and go and, it really is something that's possible for nearly all people. So, yeah, just take that message of connection and say thank you, Nikki Leader, for today. Thank you so much to everyone for listening or watching. It's been the Seen and Heard podcast, conversational series. I've been with Nikki Leader, and if you want to learn more about Nikki's work, there will be links in the show notes from today. But we'll leave with, it's all about connection, and hope to see you on a future episode.
Yeah.
But thank you, Nikki, for today.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay,
Take care.
bye.
Bye.